The grand palace of the Volanti Empire stretched across the horizon like a mountain made of crystal and light. And Captain Kang Do-yoon stood at its entrance feeling very small. He had fought in 3 wars, saved his squad from certain death twice, and earned every medal the United Earth military could offer. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. The Volanti were beautiful in a way that made humans feel like children looking at the stars for the first time. And their bodies glowed with soft bioluminescent light that shifted colors with their emotions. Do-yoon walked through halls filled with alien dignitaries from a dozen different species, and all of them turned to stare at the human soldier in his simple dress uniform. The Terran representative announced a Volanti herald, his voice echoing through the massive throne room. Captain Kang Do-yoon of Earth. The throne room fell silent as Do-yoon marched forward with military precision, his boots clicking against the polished floor that reflected the glow of hundreds of Volanti. Nobles. Emperor Valthros sat upon a throne of living crystal, and beside him stood his 7 daughters, each one more radiant than any star Do-yoon had ever seen. Almost each 1/6 of the princesses blazed with brilliant light that hurt to look at directly, their glow filling the space around them like small suns. But the 7th princess stood apart from her sisters with light so dim she almost seemed to fade into the shadows. Human, the emperor spoke, and his voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of civilization. You come to participate in the ceremony of selection? I do, your imperial majesty, Do-yoon replied with a bow. The ceremony was ancient beyond measure, a tradition where allied species could request partnership with members of the imperial family to strengthen bonds between civilizations. And Earth desperately needed this alliance. Whispers filled the room as nobles placed bets on which princess the human would choose. He will pick Yevani, a Kethrani diplomat hissed to his companion. The eldest glows brightest, and even primitives understand brightness means power. Perhaps the Sara, another noble suggested. She commands the imperial fleet, and humans love their weapons. Princess Yevani stepped forward, a light blazing like a supernova, and she smiled at Do-yoon with the confidence of someone who had never been refused anything in her entire life. Human soldier, she said sweetly, I would welcome your partnership, and together we could bring great glory to both our peoples. The court murmured approval, and several nobles nodded, as if the matter was already decided. Do-yoon looked at Yevani, then at each of her brilliant sisters, and then his eyes found the dim princess standing alone in the corner, where shadows seemed to gather around her like old friends. Her name was Seolara, and she did not even look up when Do-yoon's gaze found her, because she had learned long ago that no one ever truly looked at her. Do-yoon began to walk the court, held its breath as he moved past Princess Yevani, whose smile flickered with confusion, and past Princess Desara, whose military bearing stiffened with surprise. He walked past each glowing princess until he stood before Seolara. And then Captain Kang Do-yoon of Earth knelt on one knee before the dimmest princess of the Volanti Empire. Prince Seolara, he said clearly so that everyone could hear, I request the honor of partnership with you. The silence that followed was so complete that Do-yoon could hear his own heartbeat, and the court erupted. What madness is this? Lord Thiessen, a powerful Volanti general, shouted from his place among the nobles. The human chooses the dim one? A Kethrani ambassador laughed. Truly, these Terrans are as primitive as we suspected. An insult, cried another noble. He mocks our sacred ceremony. But Do-yoon did not move from his knee, and his eyes never left Selara's face. The dim princess stared at him with an expression he could not read, and her faint light flickered like a candle in the wind. Human, she whispered, and her voice was soft like rain falling on leaves. Do you mock me? No, your highness, Do-yoon answered. I do not. Then you are a fool, she said, but there was no anger in her words. only a sadness that came from years of being overlooked and dismissed. My sisters glow with the light of stars, and I barely manage the light of a dying ember. So what could you possibly want with me? Do-hyun smiled, and it was a smile that had comforted dying soldiers and frightened enemies in equal measure. Your Highness, he said, where I come from, we learned a long time ago that the brightest flames burn out the fastest. But the smallest light in the darkness is often the one that guides lost travelers home. Cielara's dim glow flickered again, and for just a moment, Do-hyun thought he saw it grow slightly brighter. Emperor Valthrus raised his hand, and the court fell silent once more. The human has made his choice, the Emperor declared, and though his voice was neutral, his eyes studied Do-hyun with new interest. The ceremony is complete, and Captain Kang Do-hyun of Earth is now bonded in partnership with Princess Cilara. The court buzzed with whispers and barely hidden laughter as nobles shook their heads at the foolish human who had thrown away his chance at true power. Lord Thesan pushed through the crowd until he stood before Do-hyun, and his glow pulsed red with barely contained anger. You were supposed to choose Yavani, he growled. The alliance between Earth and the fleet would have been unstoppable. But instead you chose the useless one, the dim princess who contributes nothing to this empire. Do-hyun rose to his feet and met the general's glowing eyes without fear. With respect, General, he said calmly. I have learned in my years as a soldier that the things which seem useless often prove to be the most valuable when the darkness comes. Cezanne's light flared dangerously bright, and for a moment Do-hyun thought the general might strike him. But then Thesan stepped back with a sneer. You have made a foolish choice. Human, he warned. The dim princes will bring you nothing but shame. And when you realize your mistake, do not come crying to me for a second chance. Do-hyun watched the general storm away, and then he turned back to Cilara, who still stood frozen in disbelief. Your Highness, he said gently, offering his hand, shall we go somewhere quieter to talk? Cilara looked at his hand as if it might bite her, but then slowly, hesitantly, she placed her dim fingers in his, and in the shadows of the grand throne room, her light flickered once more. The eastern wing of the palace had not seen visitors in many years, and dust gathered in corners that servants had long stopped cleaning. Ciara led Do-hyun through empty corridors where the lights flickered and the walls showed cracks that no one had bothered to repair. And he understood without asking that this was where she lived. Welcome to my quarters, she said quietly as she opened a door to reveal a modest room filled with books and star charts and agricultural reports stacked in neat piles. It is not as grand as my sister's chambers, but it is mine. Do-hyun looked around with genuine interest, noting the careful organization and the well-worn pages of books that have been read many times. It feels like a home, he said. Not a display case? Cilara turned to face him, and her dim light pulsed with confusion. Why did you choose me, human? She asked. And please do not give me pretty words about small flames, because I have heard enough lies to last 10 lifetimes, and I would prefer honest cruelty to kind deception. Do-hyun sat down on a simple chair without being invited, and Cilara's eyes widened at the informality. I watched everyone in that throne room, he said. Your sisters glowed bright and smiled bright and spoke bright words, but their eyes were empty like windows with no one home. He leaned forward with his hands clasped together. But you, Princess, you stood in the shadows and watched everything, and your eyes were full of thoughts that no one bothered to ask about. Ciara looked away, and her dim glow flickered in a pattern. Do-hyun was beginning to recognize his emotion. You see too much for a human, she murmured. My grandmother used to say the same thing, he replied with a smile. Smilia. Ciara moved to a window that overlooked gardens that had once been beautiful, but now grew wild and untamed. and she stared out at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. "I was born during an eclipse," she said softly. "The day the sun disappeared and darkness covered our world for 3 hours, and when I emerged, my light was dim while my sisters blazed like torches." Dahan listened without interrupting. "Our people believe that brightness equals worth," she continued. "A bright Volanti is strong and capable and blessed by the universe, while a dim Volanti is weak and cursed and better forgotten." She turned to face him, and for the first time, Dahan saw anger beneath her sadness. "I have spent my entire life trying to prove that belief wrong," she said. "I studied agriculture when my sisters studied warfare, and I learned diplomacy when they learned to command, because I knew I would never shine bright enough to lead armies or inspire crowds. What did you accomplish?" Dahan Skedsialara laughed bitterly. 3 famines prevented through better crop rotation, 2 droughts survived through water management, and 4 billion citizens fed through programs I designed," she answered. "But my name appears on none of the reports, because who would believe the dim princess could achieve anything?" Dahan's expression did not change, but inside he felt a familiar anger rising. The same anger he felt whenever he saw good soldiers overlooked because they did not know how to play politics. "And the peace with the Varati?" He asked. Skedsialara's dim light flickered with surprise. "How do you know about that?" "I read the reports before coming here," Dahan said. "The official story says Princess Thesara negotiated the peace through a show of military strength, but the details did not make sense to me, because the Varati do not respond to shows of force." Cialara stared at him for a long moment. "You are the first person to notice," she said quietly. "I spent 3 months learning their language and their customs, and I discovered they were not attacking us out of aggression, but out of desperation because their food supplies were failing. You gave them agricultural aid." Dahan finished. "In secret," Cialara confirmed. "Because if anyone knew the dim princess had saved the empire from war through kindness instead of strength, it would have embarrassed the court." She sat down across from him, and her dim light began to glow just slightly brighter. "You truly read the reports," she said with wonder. "I read everything I could find about this empire," Dahan replied. "And the more I read, the more I found your fingerprints on every quiet success and every prevented disaster. And I knew before I arrived that you were the one I would choose." Before Cialara could respond, the door burst open and Lord Thesan strode in with several noble allies behind him. "There you are." "Human," the general sneered. "Hiding in the shadows with the dim princess like rats in a hole." Dahan stood slowly, placing himself between Thesan and Cialara. "General," he said calmly, "I believe knocking is customary before entering someone's private quarters." "Private quarters?" Thesan laughed. "This forgotten corner of the palace barely qualifies as a storage room, and you dare lecture me on courtesy?" The nobles behind him chuckled, and their bright lights filled the room with harsh illumination that made Cialara shrink back. "I came to give you one last chance." "Human," Thesan said, "renounce your foolish choice and select Princess Yvonne as you should have, and I will forget this insult ever happened." Dahan did not move. "My choice stands," he said. Thesan's glow pulsed red with fury. "Then you are an even bigger fool than I thought," he spat. "The dim princess will drag your species into irrelevance. And when the Kethrani horde comes knocking at your doorstep, do not expect the fleet to save you." He turned and stormed out, his eyes following with mocking glances at Cialara, and they were gone. Cialara's dim light had faded to almost nothing, and she stood with her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her pieces together. "You should listen to him," she whispered. "I am not worth the trouble I will cause you." Dahan turned to face her, and his eyes held a warmth that made her dim light flicker. "Your Highness," he said gently, "where I come from, we have a saying that the people who think they are not worth saving are usually the ones worth saving the most. He offered his hand again, just as he had in the throne room. I chose you because you are exactly what this empire needs, he said, even if the empire is too blind to see it yet. Silara looked at his hand, and this time she did not hesitate before taking it, and in her dim glow, something new began to spark. The diplomatic summit brought together representatives from 30 different species, and the grand hall buzzed with conversations in 100 different languages. Doan stood beside Silara as delegates from across the galaxy mingled and negotiated and formed alliances. And he noticed how everyone seemed to look right through the dim princess as if she were invisible. Ambassador Kel, a Velanthi noble, called out to a passing Kathrani diplomat. Have you met the human representative and his partner? The Kathrani turned with 4 glittering eyes, and his mandibles clicked in what Do-Yoon had learned was their version of a smirk. Ah yes, the human who chose the broken lamp, Kel chittered. Tell me, Captain, do your people also collect defective machinery as a hobby? Several nearby aliens laughed, and Silara's dim light flickered with pain. She tried hard to hide Odoin's smile pleasantly. Ambassador Kel, he replied, I have read that the Kathrani were once considered a weak species that other empires dismissed as pests. Is that correct? The laughter stopped abruptly. That was centuries ago, Kel hissed. Before we proved our worth through conquest. Indeed, Do-Yoon nodded. And now your people rule 17 systems. All because someone once underestimated you. He let the words hang in the air. I wonder how many empires have fallen because they dismissed something they did not understand. Kel's mandibles clicked rapidly, and he turned away without another word. Zialara looked at Do-Yoon with wide eyes. You should not make enemies on my behalf, she whispered. I did not make an enemy, Do-Yoon replied. I made him think, and sometimes that is more dangerous. Before Zialara could respond, a horn sounded through the hall, and Emperor Valfros entered with his advisors trailing behind him like the tail of a comet. Honored guests, the Emperor announced, I must share grave news. For the Kathrani horde has sent an ultimatum. The hall fell silent. They demand we surrender 3 border systems or face total war. Valfros continued. We have 7 days to respond. Chaos erupted as diplomats shouted and generals argued, and noble houses blamed each other for the crisis. Do-Yoon watched Silara's face, and he saw something change in her dim eyes. You know something? He said quietly. The Kathrani horde is not like Ambassador Kel's people. She replied just as quietly. They are a splinter faction that broke away decades ago, and they have been raiding border colonies for resources. Why would they suddenly demand surrender? Silara's dim light pulsed thoughtfully. I do not know. But their demands make no sense, she said. Those 3 systems have no strategic value, and the horde has never sought territory before. Only supplies. You should tell the Emperor. Silara laughed bitterly. No one listens to the dim princess. An hour later, Do-Yoon found himself in the Imperial War Council, standing behind Silara as generals and admirals argued over battle strategies. We strike first, and strike hard, Lord Thiessen bellowed. The horde numbers only 300 ships, while our fleet commands thousands. A direct assault could trigger a wider war, another admiral cautioned. Then we appear weak. Thiessen roared. Emperor Valfros raised his hand for silence. Princess Silara, he said, and the room turned to stare at the dim princess with barely hidden contempt. You studied the horde during your agricultural projects, did you not? Silara stepped forward, her dim light flickering nervously. Yes, father, she said. The horde raided our farming colonies for years, and I learned their patterns to better protect our supplies. Then speak. The Emperor commanded. Silara took a breath. The horde's ultimatum does not match their usual behavior, she began. They have always avoided direct confrontation, because their ships are outdated and their weapons are inferior. So why would they suddenly threaten war against a superior force? Because they are desperate fools, Thiessen interrupted. Or because they have no other choice, Ciolara continued. I believe something has happened in Horde space that forced their hand. Perhaps a disaster they cannot admit publicly, and if we respond with force, we will only confirm their belief that the Empire is their enemy. What would you suggest then? The Emperor asked. Send a diplomatic envoy before the fleet, Ciolara replied. Learn what truly drives their ultimatum. And perhaps we can find a solution that avoids bloodshed entirely. The room erupted with dismissive laughter. Diplomacy with raiders? Thiessen sneered. Next, the dim princess will suggest we invite them to dinner. But Do-Hyun had heard enough. Your Majesty, he said, stepping forward. Permission to speak? The Emperor studied the human with curiosity. Speak, Captain. On Earth. We have fought many wars, Do-Hyun said. Some were necessary. And some were mistakes born from pride and misunderstanding. And the worst wars were always the ones that could have been avoided if someone had simply asked why. He gestured toward Ciolara. Princess Ciolara is the only one in this room who's actually studied the Horde. And she is the only one asking the right questions. So perhaps the Empire should listen before the fleet launches? Thassan's face twisted with rage. You dare lecture this council? Human? I dare to suggest that wisdom should be heard, General. Regardless of how brightly the speaker glows, the room fell silent. And Emperor Valfrus stared at his dim daughter, as if seeing her for the first time. The human speaks for my dimmest daughter, he said slowly. How unexpected. He rose from his throne. The fleet will prepare for war. But we will also prepare a diplomatic envoy, he declared. If negotiation fails, we will still have our weapons. It was not a victory. But it was not a defeat either, as the council dispersed. Ciolara caught Do-Hyun's arm. You should not have spoken, she said. But her dim light glowed just slightly brighter than before. Someone needed to, he replied, and in the shadows of the War Council chamber, something like hope began to grow. The Kethrani Horde struck 3 days before the deadline, and the Volanthi border colonies, burned under their sudden assault. Do-Hyun stood on the bridge of the Imperial flagship as chaos erupted around him. Watching admirals shout orders and officers scrambled to respond to the unexpected attack. 30,000 dead in the first wave. An officer reported, Colony Vessel 9 has been destroyed. Lord Thiessen grabbed a tactical display with glowing hands. All ships advance. He commanded. We crushed them with overwhelming force. The Volanthi fleet surged forward, thousands of warships blazing toward the Horde's position. But something was wrong. General, the Horde is retreating. A censor officer called out, Cowards. Thiessen laughed. They flee before our might. But Do-Hyun had seen this tactic before. It is a trap, he said quietly. No one heard him over the celebration. The Volanthi fleet chased the retreating Horde through an asteroid field. And that is when the second wave struck from hidden positions among the rocks. Ambush. Someone screamed as Horde ships emerged from every direction. The flagship shook as weapons fire raked across its hull. And Do-Hyun grabbed a console to keep his balance. Thessen's confident expression twisted into shock as his brilliant strategy crumbled around him. How is this possible? He demanded. Their ships are inferior. Their ships are old, General, Do-Hyun replied grimly. That does not mean their commanders are stupid within hours. The mighty Volanthi fleet was scattered and bleeding, limping back toward the inner systems with the Horde nipping at their heels. Emperor Valfrus summoned an emergency council. And this time, the throne room held none of the usual ceremony. We have lost 40% of the fleet, an admiral reported grimly. The Horde used tactics we have never seen before, because we have never bothered to study them, Ciolara said quietly from her corner, Every eye turned to the dim princess. "Explain yourself." The Emperor commanded. Cialara stepped forward. Her dim light steady despite the hostile stares. "The Horde has always been raiders, not conquerors," she said. "Their tactics evolved from hit-and-run survival, not from military academies. So they fight in ways our strategists never anticipated." "Then what do you suggest, dear sister?" Princess Yvonne asked with barely hidden contempt. "Since you apparently know so much about our enemies?" Cialara ignored the insult. "We stopped chasing them and forced them to chase us," she answered. "We withdraw to the Calith corridor, where the asteroid fields favor our larger ships. And we make them come to us on ground we have chosen. Retreat?" Thiessen spat. "You would have us run like cowards?" "I would have us survive," Cialara replied calmly. "And while the fleet holds the corridor, we open negotiations to discover what truly drives the Horde's aggression. Negotiate with those who murdered 30,000 of our citizens. Discover why they murdered them," Cialara countered. "The Horde gains nothing from this war, so why did they start it?" The Emperor sat in silence for a long moment. "We have followed your strategies before, General Thiessen," he finally said, "and they have failed us. So now we will try something different." He looked at his dim daughter with an expression Doyen could not read. "Princess Cialara will coordinate the diplomatic efforts while the fleet holds the corridor." The sun's light flared. "Dangerously, Your Majesty, this is madness." "This is my command," Valthros replied coldly, "and Captain Doyen will lead the ground defense of the corridor's key station." Doyen straightened in surprise. "Your Majesty? You spoke for my daughter when no one else would," the Emperor said. "Now prove that your faith was not misplaced." 6 hours later, Doyen stood with 50 human marines and 200 Valanti soldiers at Station Khalid 7, the critical choke point that controlled access to the inner systems. The Horde would have to take this station to advance, and Doyen intended to make them pay for every inch. Captain, his second-in-command Lieutenant Park Minjae reported. "Horde ships approaching. Estimated arrival in 20 minutes." Doyen checked his weapon and looked at the mixed force of humans and Volanti around him. "Listen up," he called out. "The fleet needs time to regroup, and Princess Cialara needs time to negotiate, so our job is simple. We hold this station until someone tells us to stop." A young Volanti soldier raised a glowing hand. "Captain, the humans number only 50. How can you hope to make a difference?" Doyen smiled grimly. "Son, humans have been fighting against impossible odds since we crawled out of caves with sharp sticks. And we are still here. The Horde hit the station like a tidal wave, and the defenders fought with everything they had. Ophune moved through the chaos like a force of nature, directing fire teams and plugging gaps in the line, and refusing to give ground even when the Volanti soldiers around him began to waver. Hold the line." He roared as another wave of Horde soldiers poured through a breach. The human marines fought with a ferocity that shocked their Volanti allies. And the station held meanwhile, across the stars. Cialara sat in a small communication chamber and opened a channel to the Horde. "Command ship, this is Princess Cialara of the Volanti Empire," she said. "I wish to speak with your leader." A harsh voice crackled back. "The dim princess? They send their weakest to beg for mercy? They send the one who is willing to listen," Cialara replied calmly. "Tell me why you truly attacked us." Silence stretched for a long moment. "You would not understand." The voice finally said, "Try me," and slowly, reluctantly, the truth emerged that plague had swept through Horde space, destroying their food supplies and leaving millions starving. But when they had approached the Empire for aid, they had been dismissed as pests unworthy of assistance. "We sent 12 envoys," the Horde commander revealed. 12 times we begged for help, and 12 times your generals laughed and turned us away." Cialara's dim light flickered with understanding. So you attacked because you had no other choice. Our children were dying, the commander replied. What would you have done? Cialara closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, her dim light burned just a little brighter. Let me offer you another choice. 1 month after the peace treaty was signed, the imperial throne room gleamed with light brighter than it had in centuries. Doan stood in his formal uniform, newly decorated with Velanthi honors alongside his human medals, and he watched as dignitaries from across the galaxy gathered to witness something no one had expected. Princess Cialara walked down the center of the hall, and her light no longer flickered with uncertainty. It blazed not as bright as her sisters, perhaps, but steady and warm, like a hearth fire that promised safety and comfort to all who sought the treaty she had negotiated, gave the Kethrani Horde emergency food supplies and agricultural technology in exchange for peace and future cooperation. And what could have been a devastating war became instead the foundation for an alliance that would strengthen both peoples. Emperor Valthrus rose from his throne as Cialara approached. Citizens of the Empire, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive room. I have ruled for 300 years, and in that time, I believed I understood the nature of strength. He looked at his 6 brightest daughters, standing in their positions of honor. I raised my children to glow with fierce light, to command respect through brilliance and power, and I measured their worth by how brightly they burned. His gaze moved to Cialara. I was wrong. The room stirred with shock as the Emperor descended from his throne and stood before his dimmest daughter. Princess Cialara saved this empire not through strength of arms or brilliance of light, but through wisdom, compassion, and the courage to listen when others would only shout. He reached up and removed a crystal medallion from his own neck, the symbol of imperial trust that had not been granted in 5,000 years. You saw what the brightest eyes could not see, he said, placing the medallion around Cialara's neck. You heard what the loudest voices refused to hear, and you saved millions of lives on both sides of a war that should never have happened. Cialara's light pulsed with emotion she could not hide. Father, I only did what needed to be done, and that, the Emperor replied, is exactly why you deserve this honor. The crowd erupted in applause, and Doyun smiled as he watched the dim princess finally receive the recognition she had earned through a lifetime of quiet service. But the ceremony was not over. Lord Thesan stepped forward, and his brilliant light had dimmed with shame. Princess Cialara, he said stiffly, I have come to offer my formal apology. The room fell silent. Dismissed you as worthless because your light did not match my expectations, Thesan continued. I mocked your human partner because I believed primitive species could not understand true value, and I nearly led this empire to destruction because of my arrogance. He bowed deeply. I was wrong, and I am sorry. Cialara studied the general for a long moment. Rise. Lord Thesan, she said finally, wisdom often comes from failure, and I would rather have an ally who learned from his mistakes than an enemy who never will. Thesan rose with something like respect in his eyes. Then Emperor Valthrus turned to Doyun. Captain Kang Doyun of Earth, he said, you chose my daughter when no one else would, and you defended our station when retreat would have been easier. So I must ask you something. Dohyun bowed. Yes, Your Majesty? Why did you truly choose her? The room leaned forward to hear his answer. Dohyun looked at Cialara, and his expression softened. Your Majesty, on Earth, we have a long and painful history, he said. We have fought wars over differences in skin color, religion, and beliefs that seem foolish now. And we have learned slowly and painfully that true worth is never found in the obvious places. He turned to face the crowd. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the wisest. The brightest star in the sky is rarely the closest. And the person who seems weakest is often the one carrying burdens no one else can see. He looked back at Ciolara. I chose Princess Ciolara because I recognized something in her that I have seen in the best soldiers I ever served with. A quiet strength that does not need to announce itself, a courage that does not seek glory, and a heart that cares more about doing what is right than being seen as important. Ciolara's light blazed brighter than it ever had before. That is why I chose her. Dohyun finished. And I would make the same choice again without hesitation. The crowd applauded. But Ciolara raised her hand for silence. My glow was never truly dim, she said. And her voice carried to every corner of the hall. Volanthi light does not measure inherent worth. It responds to being seen and valued by others. And for my entire life, no one ever truly looked at me. She turned to face Dohyun, until a human soldier knelt before me and saw what everyone else had ignored. She took his hand in front of the entire court. Our people believe that the brightest lights lead the way, she continued. But sometimes the universe sends a different kind of guide. Someone from a species we consider primitive. Someone who understood what we had forgotten. She looked out at the gathered aliens from dozens of species. Humans are not the strongest species in this galaxy, nor the most advanced, nor the most numerous. But perhaps they see things that we cannot. Ambassador Kell of the Kethrani stepped forward. What else do humans see that we have missed? He asked, and this time there was no mockery in his voice. Only genuine curiosity smiled. We see that the galaxy is full of peoples who are more similar than they are different. He answered, we see that strength means nothing without wisdom, and power means nothing without compassion, and light means nothing without darkness to give it meaning. He looked at Ciolara, and her light reflected in his eyes. Mostly, we see potential in places others have learned to ignore. The ceremony concluded with the formal recognition of the Human-Volanthi Alliance. But the true change had already begun in the months that followed. Other species began to look more carefully at the members of their own societies they had dismissed. And old prejudices began to crumble as Ciolara's story spread across the galaxy and in the eastern wing of the palace, which was no longer neglected. A dim princess and a human soldier sat together in a garden that bloomed with new life. Thank you, Ciolara said softly. For seeing me, Dohyun squeezed her hand. Thank you for being worth seeing. And across the stars, a new light had begun to shine.